Hello, welcome back to How to Read a Poem. Now today I'm going to do a interesting but a bit abstract poem by Richard Wilbur. It's called Mine. Now, one of the things you need to take note in the reading of this poem is the use of a conceit. Now, what is a conceit? It is a term used to describe metaphysical poetry of the 16th and 17th centuries and which may well apply to this poem, which is the use of an ingenious, unexpected, and totally out of this world metaphor in order to describe and elucidate and illuminate a subject matter. Now, for this poem, in general, the activity of a bat is used as a metaphorical comparison to the activity of the mind or the intellect. So let's see how Richard Wilbur talks about the relationship between the inner psychological intellectual landscape of a mind and the external world, and what surprising insights the poem reaches by the end. So we start by mind. Of course, mind, we're here made to understand a broad range of concepts: thinking, imagination, psychology, even stream of consciousness. So let's have all these concepts in play in the poem. So it begins mind in its purest play. Now think about this notion of play, implying a sort of spontaneity, implying a sort of happy, chaotic tendency about it. So mind in its purest play, mind in its purest form of play. So we might think about a mind that is unencumbered by reason, that is unencumbered by rational thinking, that might be unencumbered by intellectual thought. A mind that freely associates, a mind that engages in stream of consciousness thinking, a mind that engages in play. So mind in its purest play. You might think about some of the days where you're not thinking of anything, where you let your mind wander, where strange concepts can link together in this sort of wealth of associative thinking. Now put yourself in that state of mind. So mind in its purest play. When a person engages in that sort of intellectual free play, now he resembles some sort of bat. Now here the conceit comes in. Now what activity of a bat? A bat that beats about in caverns all alone. So you think about the shape of a cavern. You think about its almost sort of enclosed nature as perhaps indicating the enclosed nature of the human mind, the human skull, for instance. So here we see on a physical level there are links being drawn between the cavern of the bat, the place where it conducts its activity, and the shape of the mind, the shape of the head. You might even say the shape of the brain. So the bat that beats about in caverns all alone. Here we get the activity of the bat. It beats about. Now if you see nature documentaries about bats and they're flying about in the dark, you might think about it also in the same way. It doesn't have any fixed pattern. It goes about in a sort of chaotic fashion. It doesn't obey any sort of structure. So the poet wants to link the activity of the mind to the sort of flitting about in the cave of the bat. So let's see how the comparison gets teased out further. So it beats about in caverns all alone. So the bat is all alone, the bat is isolated, and we might say the mind in its purest play is also alone. We take delight in the inner workings of the mind without any outer distraction, without any second person to maybe engage us in conversation. So by far, the outrageous conceit works to suggest the activity of the mind, contriving by a kind of senseless wit not to conclude against a wall of stone. Now here, think about the interesting verbs that Wilbur uses. The bat contrives. Now we've talked about in the previous slide how the bat's activity seems to be almost random, seems to be spontaneous. But there is a sort of contrivance in it. There's a sort of purpose to it. There is a sort of activity that is controlled. It contrives. Now what does it contrive? By a kind of senseless wit, not to conclude, i.e. not to hit itself against a wall of stone, not to conclude it's flying here and there. So we get the bat contriving. So we get an idea of some sort of purpose, we get an idea of some sort of structure, but at the same time we get an idea of spontaneity, we get an idea of the almost random nature of the activity. Beats about, bouncing in caverns all alone. So we have these two kinds of activities that are juxtaposed against each other, again suggesting the complexity of the matter, again suggesting that when we are free associating also, when we are obeying the sort of randomness of our thoughts, we don't do it completely without purpose. There is a sort of sense against it. The mental life is in a happy state of chaos. It is not in a state of completely random, arbitrary kind of chaos. So contriving by a kind So not anything definite, but what the poem suggests, a kind of senseless wit. So wit, you might understand intelligence, you might understand intellect, but it's also senseless, it's also irrational, it's also anti-intellectual. So we see all these terms put against each other to suggest the complex activity of the bat, and by the workings of the metaphor to suggest the complexity of the mind in its purest plane. So the mind goes on like the bat. It goes on in all sorts of different directions, but it takes care not to conclude against a wall of stone. We take delight in the mental act of thinking, in the productivity of our thoughts also. Second stanza, it has no need to falter or explore. Darkly it knows what obstacles there are. So the bat has no need to falter. The bat has no need to explore, because in a sense it knows what's there already. So we also know the contours of our mind, maybe we might say. It has no need to falter. We know that it is not the kind of senseless activity. We know how to conduct this activity of thinking. So the bat also, although it's dark, although we might hear the popular adage, bats are blind. They figure their way about in caves through their highly evolved sense of hearing. So darkly it knows what obstacles there are, and so it may weave and filter, dip and saw in perfect courses through the blackest air. So the activity of the bat is described as perfect. It's perfect because nature has fitted with exactly the tools it needs in order to engage in this sort of activity, but also to protect itself against concluding against a wall of stone. So think about the activity of the bat now. Think about its elaboration here in the third line of the second stanza. It may weave and filter. You might think of an activity that goes up and down, back and forth, right to left. It may weave and it may flitter. Now think about those verbs in relation to the mind's activity. So when we talk about the mind weaving, you might think about stitching. You might think about joining together concepts. And so again, this is one activity that maybe free association results in our ability to imagine, in our ability to stitch together concepts that we may not have stitched together, that we may not have pieced together in our rational frame of mind. If anything, this poem might describe the workings of the creative imagination. We often think about poetry, literature, as a sort of activity that associates, that deals with ambiguity, that deals in the richness of concepts, that trades in the line between literal and implied language and weaves together disparate concepts. And you might think about the poem as a whole, the poem in its almost audacious linking of the bat and the mind in its similar activity conducts a sort of similar weaving. So the poem's language puts its subject matter in touch. And so, in a sense, language, form, and theme of the poem, they are all weaved together. Now take note, this is not a random activity. There is some sort of contrivance here. And it might describe, therefore, the overall structure of this poem. So the bat weaves, the bat flitters, the bat dips, and the bat soars. It's almost given the majestic aura of an eagle as it dips and soars in the air. And it's even more remarkable that it does so in the blackest air. We see all these words coming together to describe the activity of the bat and by extension the activity of the mind. So far, so good. The poem has sort of convinced us in a sort of magical sleight of hand that the activity of the mind and the activity of the bat are linked together in some intrinsic way through the metaphorical workings of the poem. However, the brilliant last stanza will seek to revise this. Let's read on. And as this simile alike perfection, so the poet is acknowledging this idea of simile. Again, this idea of connection. Metaphor, similes, they are rhetorical tropes that connect ideas together. As brave as a lion, or he is a lion. So these two concepts are joined together. So the rhetorical question starts the third stanza. There's a question, i.e. there's a sort of doubt that's being placed by the end of the first two stanzas. And as is simply a like perfection, the mind is like a bat. That's the tentative conclusion. Precisely. Safe. The word safe draws attention to the tentative nature of the conclusion, but also suggests that in one respect, the activity of the mind is not like the activity of the bat. Let's read on. Safe, line break, that in the very happiest intellection, so now the emphasis is drawn back to the mind, that in the very happiest intellection, in the very happy, you read perfect. Intellection, i.e. the course of thought, i.e. the stringing together of ideas, i.e. the mind in its purest play. A graceful error may correct the cave. So think about that, right? Why is the human mind maybe superior to the workings of the bat? We might say nature is blind, just as the bat is blind. But we human beings, we have the tendency, the happy tendency to correct, to change. So think about what the poet is trying to say, that in the very happiest intellection, in this process of thinking, in this process of free association, in this process of linking ideas together, in mind in its purest play, in the idea of intellection, a graceful error may correct the cave. So whereas the bat tries its hardest not to conclude against the cave, i.e. not to smash its head against nature that can't be changed. It obeys the blind dictates of nature. That's what it's built for. That's what it's evolved for. The mind is different. A graceful error, almost a paradoxical statement here. An error, we might think of something ungainly, something that stands out for the wrong reasons. But there is grace to be found in the error. So the human mind, in its working, deals with both facts and error. But error may serve the overall structure of the mind, because the error in its gracefulness may correct the cave, may make the shape of the cave different, may make the workings of the mind change. And so therefore, whereas the bat cannot adapt, whereas the bat only flies here and there, its only thought is not to conclude against the cave, we can change the contours of our thinking. We can use our concepts in order to understand the world differently. We may come up with some new discoveries. We make something that changes the way we look at reality. So, by the end of the poem, Richard Wilbur suggests, whereas the workings of the mind and the flying around of the bat may have some kind of similarity, it is ultimately the human being's ability to reflect, the human being's ability to use his expansive intellect in order to change the coordinates of his or her thinking that results in a more heightened, maybe, sense of reality and a more productive use of the imagination the next time round. So mind in purest play, it expands. In this expansion, there is hope that its errors may be corrected. There is hope that human perfectibility may be achieved through this playing of the mind, which the bat in its blind obedience to its nature and to Mother Nature cannot therefore achieve or hope to transcend. This is how to read a poem. Thank you.